Hello guys, Winston here. As much as I am into CNC woodworking and machining, I am always on the lookout to find new ways to blend my primary hobby with other arts and disciplines, because without the right motivations and influences, CNC work becomes, as its name implies, computerized, robotic, lifeless. So when my girlfriend's birthday was coming up, I saw the perfect opportunity to try something new. For years now, I had wanted to try making string art with a CNC. Now I had an excuse to give it a shot. And also, for the record, I had contingency gift ideas in mind if this didn't work out. If you're not familiar with string art, just do a quick Google search. It's pretty straightforward. You hammer in some nails in a pattern and wrap string around them. The resulting fill becomes a visual representation of whatever you want it to be. To me, it always seemed like a medium that could be as simple or complex as you wanted it to be. It's an open-ended version of connect the dots, but with near infinite possibilities for traversing between nodes. There's also a lot of room to be clever and economical in how you approach your design. I had always presumed that with the power of a CNC, this would be a breeze. I could take care of all the tedious work of accurately locating nails via pre-drilled holes, and then take care of the creative elements of my string art in a nice, relaxed fashion. In hindsight, that was a dumb, short-sighted, narrow assessment of a problem which shouldn't be surprising coming from an engineer. The artistic portion I really struggled on. But let's gloss over my struggles and focus on the overall process. Step 1 was to find a subject for said string art. My girlfriend is a bit of a beach bum, and we had been planning a trip to Hawaii, so I thought an ocean-themed bit of string art would be cool to make and give to her right before our trip. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to turn into string art though, so I fired up my browser and started looking for inspiration. I did a Google image search for oceany vectors and it really didn't give me much to go on. And Etsy, where I tend to think there are slightly higher quality paid SVGs, also lacked anything with the style or complexity that I desired. But with a little refinement of my search, I started narrowing in on some promising candidates. The biggest help was removing vector from my search terms. There just aren't a lot of variety in SVG results, and I was more interested in seeing different artistic styles than getting art that was ready to go. The term wave art produced a lot of results, but a lot of these follow the same aesthetic as the Great Wave of Kanagawa, and I really wanted something more modern. When I searched Hawaiian wave art, things got a lot better. My eye was immediately caught by the work of Sean Thomas. Not only does he apparently have his search engine optimization game on point because he comes up in searches a lot for location plus wave art queries, but his approach of distilling a beach scene into very basic elements using a simple color palette and tactfully stylizing elements like the waves and sky, his work gave me a very good starting point, but to make something original I needed to qualify both the similarities and differences I'd want to incorporate into my own artwork. These were my ground rules. First of all, I needed a wave that's kind of fundamental to the whole Hawaii theme, and it didn't need to be super realistic. A stylized representation would be just fine. Secondly, I wanted a sunset theme, so the sun had to be in there somewhere, and it was probably going to be in the middle because as an artistic imposter, I really wasn't comfortable playing with the golden ratio or rule of thirds. The focal point would be right in the middle. Thirdly, Hawaii is known for its lush vegetation and varied topography. I wanted green rolling hills and mountains with a splash of sandy beaches. And fourth, I wanted a kind of pastel-y palette for the sky and color bands in arcs. The whole process for creating the final image I wanted to turn into string art took place over several weeks. This was also kind of the first time that I'd seriously tried to use my iPad and Affinity Designer to draw anything. So nothing about my timeline or workflow can be considered representative of how a more practiced artist would approach this. Nonetheless, here's the gist of my creative process reenacted to save time. 1. Roughly sketch out where I wanted different elements. I did this on a background layer using the pen tool, a thin stroke, and no smoothing. 2. Block out where I wanted various colors with each element on a separate layer. 3. Refine the edges using a wide white stroke with generous smoothing. From there, I could convert the bitmap image into a vector. I actually used Carbide Create for this since it was easier than fiddling with Inkscape's incomprehensible UI and options. And before anyone comments on this below, could I have worked natively with vectors in Affinity Design? Yes. Did I know how to do that? No. In Affinity Designer for Mac, I simplified the resulting vector. I tend to think that there's a lot of overlap between mathematics and visual beauty. Splines with the fewest possible control points and nodes result in smoother, more natural-looking curves. So I stripped away as many nodes as possible, which brought the shapes in my design much closer to parabolic or hyperbolic representations. This simplified vector image is what I sent to Fusion 360, and I then scaled it to fit my expected workpiece size. To make the greatest use of the drilling toolpath in the CAM workspace, I first needed to model all the holes in my string art piece. Using the hole tool, I first started by strategically placing holes at vertices in my image. Then I use the pattern tool along each curve to generate multiples of my initial holes. These holes generally propagate counterclockwise along a loop, so I had to do this in stages, filling in one line segment at a time. What's critical here is that every vertex has a hole. Taking a hole and patterning it around the entire loop would often result in holes that miss the corners, which means the string would also end up cutting corners when I strung it together. This is why I did it one segment at a time. This also allowed me to vary the density of the holes along each line independently. Simple arcs like the sky could be defined with fewer holes, but the mountains in this scene required more holes spaced more closely to really capture all the undulations in their profile. In the cam workspace, I applied a drilling toolpath to one hole, and then made sure I checked the option to select all holes of the same diameter. This here is the real time saver. In this toolpath, I would drill down to a depth of about 6.5mm, since that's all I could muster with the 16th inch end mill that I would be using for this job. Now would probably be a good time to mention that I would be using 3D finishing nails with a diameter of about 0.067 inches. I wanted pre-drilled holes that I would still be able to snugly hammer nails into without requiring glue to keep them secure. By the way, if you have different sized nails, PCB drills are a great inexpensive way to create holes of just about any diameter below 1/8 of an inch. A contour toolpath to cut out the overall piece would complete the CNC program for this project. Drilling with a 16th inch end mill went just fine. I used very conservative settings with a peck depth of about 1mm. If I were to do this again, I would definitely crank things up, but here I was content to spend a little more time to avoid having to redo anything if something went wrong. And for the final cutout, I could just use an 1/8 inch downcutting end mill. Smaller tools put less force on the stock, so there was very little risk of my double-sided tape giving way on the very last pass. I used a random orbit sander really quickly to remove any fuzzies, and I was ready to go for the next step. Since a nail-studded piece of wood is a pain in the butt to apply finish to, I did 2 coats of Danish oil before proceeding. Hammering in the nails was actually a very easy and almost therapeutic part of this process. Getting them all to the same depth was very easy because once they hit the bottom of the pre-drill holes, the amount of resistance goes way up. And that 1/4 inch of depth in the pilot hole was plenty to keep the nail oriented perfectly vertical. With the nails in position and secure, I then began the process of meticulously wrapping the string around the nails, and imagining this scene in true depth, I worked from the back to the front, so starting with the sun, and then the sky, and then the terrain, and then the open ocean, and finally the waves. This meant I needed to start the first color slightly further down on the nail so that I'd have room left on the top of the nail to come around later with other colors. This is where I thought the string art process would be the most therapeutic, but there were numerous times where I ended up accidentally unraveling about 30 seconds of work. When I was weaving my string around the nails, I quickly learned to dab a bit of superglue on a previous nail like a gamer might spam the quick save button going through a challenging dungeon. That would lock in the string and make sure it wouldn't come fully unraveled if I screwed up. Another thing I learned but could do nothing about was that complex intersections were a big no-no. The more colors that end at a single point, the more crowded that nail is going to get. You end up needing more closely spaced nails to define all the details, and that gets really annoying when you've got clumsy fingers. The leading edge of my wave was one such area of regret, as I had multiple different colors and shapes converging at a single point. This exercise was also a stark reminder of how humans are actually very bad at creating truly random patterns. But if you have 2 opposing lines with a same number of holes plus or minus 1, you can actually really easily create a zigzag pattern for a more stylized fill and add contrast. A couple hours later, I had all the colors in place and my piece was ready to present. The process of creating custom string art was definitely an interesting one, and though it was well received, I would probably be a bit less ambitious in the design next time. Not only am I terribly slow at drawing, but the number of color groups I needed made patterning out my holes very tedious. Fusion 360 was definitely struggling towards the end of my CAD and CAM. But doing a simpler design would be a piece of cake. One or a couple vectors could easily be populated with holes in Fusion 360. Or if you're not into Fusion, you could use a vector graphics program and do a pattern of circles along a line, and then you could bring it into any number of 2D CAM programs, including Carbide Create, and target those circles for drilling operations. The bottom line is that if you're not nearly as ambitious and OCD as I am, string art and CNCs are actually a great combination. If you or someone you know enjoys crafty projects, this could be a fun one to do or batch out as gifts. I want to thank you guys all very much for watching, and I'll be back soon with more CNC projects and DIY nonsense.